Two abandoned Amish twins shivered in the snow, their small bodies nearly disappearing into the white landscape that threatened to claim them forever. The mountain man's silhouette appeared like a giant against the winter sky, his gruff voice cutting through the howling wind as he uttered the words that would change everything. Come home. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The bitter wind swept across the frozen landscape, carrying snowflakes that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. Lena and Lyle Stoltzfus huddled together by the weathered fence line at the edge of Pine Hollow, their small bodies trembling beneath threadbare coats. The 8-year-old twins clasped their hands together so tightly their knuckles had turned white, a desperate attempt to share what little warmth remained between them. "Don't look at them," whispered a passing villager to his wife, averting his gaze from the children as if their misfortune might be contagious. The woman pulled her woolen shawl tighter, quickening her pace along the snow-covered path. Throughout the morning, several Pine Hollow residents had walked by, their hushed conversations carried on the frigid air. "The Stoltzfus orphans," they murmured. "Such a shame. But what can be done? They belong to no one now." No one stopped. No one offered shelter. In the strict order of their Amish community, orphans without family connections existed in a precarious limbo, visible yet unseen, present yet unwelcome. Lena's pale lips quivered as she pressed closer to her brother. The girl's eyes, once bright with childish wonder, now reflected only the endless white of the snow stretching before them. "We'll be all right," Lyle whispered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The boy attempted to shield his sister from the worst of the wind, his thin shoulders hunched forward protectively. Hours passed. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The twins' hopes diminished with each passing minute. No one would come. No one would claim them. They were truly alone now, abandoned to the mercy of the elements. Lena's eyelids grew heavy, the dangerous warmth of hypothermia beginning to settle into her bones. Lyle shook her gently, panic rising in his chest. "Stay awake," he pleaded. "You must stay awake." It was then that they felt it, a vibration in the ground beneath them. At first, it seemed like the rumbling of a distant wagon, but it grew stronger, more deliberate. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, crunching through the crusted snow. The twins raised their frost-nipped faces just as a massive shadow fell across them, blocking what remained of the fading light. There, emerging from the swirling snowfall like a figure from one of old Greta's tales, stood Elias Bran. The mountain man's imposing silhouette seemed to fill the entire horizon, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air as he gazed down at the abandoned children. The twins stared up at the bearded stranger, too cold and frightened to speak. In that moment, suspended between hope and fear, their fate hung in the balance as Elias Bran's shadow stretched across the snow before them. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Elias Bran materialized from the blizzard's fury. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as an oak, the mountain man cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the twins whole. Villagers who had moments before hurried past the children now froze in their tracks, watching the giant approach with a mixture of fear and fascination. Elias's reputation in Pine Hollow preceded him, a man of few words who lived alone in the woods, appearing in the village only to trade furs and game. His massive beard, flecked with ice crystals, couldn't hide the softening of his weathered face as he gazed down at Lena and Lyle. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. The twins stared up at him, their blue lips trembling, small hands still clasped together, as if they were each other's only anchor in the world. Without hesitation, Elias knelt in the snow, his movements deliberate and careful, like a bear trying not to frighten fawns. He unfastened the enormous bearskin cloak from his shoulders, the very garment that had become synonymous with his imposing presence, and wrapped it around the children's tiny frames. "Come home," he whispered, the words catching in his throat as if unused to offering comfort. His calloused hands, capable of snapping branches like twigs, now tenderly adjusted the cloak around their shoulders. The twins exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Survival instinct overcame fear. They nodded in unison. From the edge of the village square, Elder Abram watched with narrowed eyes, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Jonas the blacksmith spat into the snow, muttering about outsiders overstepping boundaries. But Miriam, standing in the doorway of her weaving shop, clasped her hands to her chest, a silent prayer of gratitude forming on her lips. Elias lifted both children effortlessly, cradling them against his chest. The bearskin enveloped them completely, leaving only their pale faces visible. The mountain man had never looked more fearsome nor more vulnerable than in this moment of unexpected compassion. "The Amish way has rules about orphans," someone called out, voice wavering with uncertainty. Elias turned, his eyes reflecting the steel of winter skies. "And what rule says children should freeze to death while good people watch?" he responded, not waiting for an answer. As he carried Lena and Lyle away from Pine Hollow, toward the forest path that led to his isolated cabin, the villagers remained rooted in place. They stood in uneasy silence, bearing witness to an act they couldn't decide was divine mercy or flagrant transgression against their carefully ordered world. The snow continued to fall, slowly erasing the giant footprints that led away from the village, carrying two small lives toward an uncertain future. The trek to Elias Brand's cabin seemed endless to the twins. Snow crunched beneath their small boots as they followed the mountain man's massive footprints through the dense forest. When they finally arrived, the wooden structure stood like a sentinel among towering pines, smoke curling from its chimney into the gray winter sky. "It ain't much," Elias muttered, his breath visible in the cold air, "but it'll keep the snow off your heads." Inside, the cabin was sparse but warm. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture. Lena and Lyle huddled together near the heat, their thin frames still shivering despite the bearskin cloak wrapped around them. That first night, the twins slept on a pallet near the fire, while Elias kept watch from his rocking chair, unsure how to comfort children who had known only rejection. By morning, a blizzard had descended, sealing them together in this woodland sanctuary for what would become weeks of isolation. Days blurred together as howling winds rattled the windows. The giant of a man moved awkwardly around the small bodies that now occupied his space, his calloused hands seemingly too rough for the gentle tasks of childcare. He winced whenever Lyle flinched at his approach, haunted by memories of a family he'd once failed to protect. "You think I'm scary?" he said one evening, voice barely audible above the crackling fire. It wasn't a question. Lena, braver than her brother, shook her head. "Not scary, just big." Something in her simple honesty cracked the ice around his heart. Slowly, routine emerged from chaos. Elias taught them to stack firewood, to identify which pine branches burned brightest, to melt snow for washing. The twins proved eager students, desperate to earn their keep. When Lyle successfully lit the morning fire without help, Elias's rare smile transformed his weathered face. At night, the mountain man began sharing stories, tales of forest creatures and changing seasons. The twins listened, wide-eyed, as his deep voice filled the cabin. Sometimes when he thought they were asleep, Elias would stare at an old carved cradle tucked in the corner, his eyes reflecting pain too deep for words. One particularly bitter evening, Lena awoke screaming from nightmares. Without hesitation, Elias gathered her into his arms, his enormous hand gently stroking her hair until sobs subsided. Lyle watched from his blankets, witnessing the tenderness hidden beneath the man's rough exterior. By the time the storms relented, something fundamental had shifted. Trust, fragile as spring ice but just as real, had formed in the flickering shadows of that isolated cabin. Outside, Pine Hollow might whisper its suspicions, but within these wooden walls, 3 lonely souls had begun to recognize what family might feel like. Word of Elias Brand's actions traveled swiftly through Pine Hollow, carried on hushed voices from doorway to doorway. Elder Abram stood rigid in his home, fingers tracing the worn leather of his family Bible as he listened to the report. His weathered face hardened into deep furrows. "The mountain man has taken the orphans?" he asked, though it wasn't truly a question. "This defies our ways. Children without parents belong to the community, not to outsiders." The messenger nodded nervously. He wrapped them in his bearskin and took them to his cabin in the woods. Outside the elder's home, the village square buzzed with speculation. Jonas Peterson hammered with unusual force at his forge, each strike punctuating his words as neighbors gathered. "That wild man knows nothing of our traditions," the blacksmith declared, sweat glistening on his brow despite the winter chill. "What right does he have to claim those children? He can barely care for himself, living like an animal in those woods." His apprentice nodded eagerly. "They say he hunts with his bare hands." Jonas smiled thinly at the exaggeration, encouraging it with his silence. He had coveted additional help at his forge, and the twins would have eventually been assigned somewhere. The thought of Elias gaining what he desired fueled the fire of his resentment. At her weaving shop across the square, Miriam Yoder listened to the growing chorus of disapproval. Her shuttle moved steadily through the loom, creating patterns that had been passed down through generations. Unlike the others, she remembered how the community had hesitated when the twins needed shelter most. "Perhaps we should consider what's best for Lena and Lyle," she suggested quietly to the women gathered to purchase yarn. "The children were freezing to death while we debated who should take them in." Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Miriam, you know the ordning. There are proper ways to handle orphans." "Yes, proper ways that left 2 children shivering in the snow," Miriam replied, her voice gentle but firm. By evening, Pine Hollow had divided itself. Most sided with Elder Abram, who announced that a council would convene to determine the proper course of action. The old ways provided security through certainty, and Elias threatened that certainty. In homes throughout the village, families gathered around dinner tables, speaking in low tones about the twins' fate. Children listened wide-eyed as parents debated whether Elias's compassion outweighed his disregard for tradition. Some recalled how he had once been part of their community before grief drove him to the wilderness. Meanwhile, in his cabin deep in the forest, unaware of the storm brewing in the village, Elias prepared a simple meal for 3 instead of 1. Old Greta hobbled through the snow-covered village square, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather-bound Bible. The village storyteller had become a fixture at evening gatherings, where Pine Hollow residents sought distraction from the bitter winter that refused to release its grip on their community. "The snow vigil is as old as these mountains," Greta announced, her voice carrying surprising strength despite her frail appearance. "When children survive abandonment in the deepest cold, they are marked by providence." Her gnarled finger traced the yellowed pages of her family Bible, pointing to passages that supposedly foretold such events. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The twins' survival at the fence line had been remarkable, even miraculous. Some who had initially condemned Elias Brand's interference now shifted uncomfortably on their benches. "Those children were meant to live," the storyteller continued, her eyes gleaming in the lantern light, "and the mountain man was sent to them. It is written here in my grandmother's hand, the giant will shelter the forgotten when others turn away." Jonas the blacksmith scoffed loudly. "Old women's tales," he muttered, but several others hushed him. Even Elder Abram, typically dismissive of Greta's stories, remained silent, his brow furrowed in contemplation. As word of the snow vigil spread through Pine Hollow, whispers transformed into animated discussions. Miriam found herself surrounded by curious women in her weaving shop, all wanting to know if she believed the twins were truly chosen. "Whether by God or by simple human kindness," she replied carefully, "those children deserve shelter and love." Meanwhile, in Elias's isolated cabin, Lena and Lyle had developed their own ritual of hope. During a brief thaw, they had discovered a small pouch of vegetable seeds in a forgotten corner of the dwelling. Without telling their guardian, they began secretly planting them in small containers along the cabin's southern window. "Do you think they'll grow?" Lyle whispered to his sister as they carefully pressed tiny seeds into the soil they'd collected from beneath the cabin floor. Lena nodded solemnly. "If we can survive the snow, these can too." She arranged the makeshift planters where sunlight might reach them during the brief daylight hours. Elias discovered their project one evening but said nothing, simply moving the containers to a sturdier shelf. The next day, he silently brought them better soil from his storage cellar. The twins understood his gesture. Like their seeds, they too were being given a chance to take root and grow. Back in the village, old Greta's prophecy continued to sow doubt among even the most traditional villagers. Perhaps Elias Brand's act of mercy wasn't defiance after all, but fulfillment of something written long ago. Perhaps the twins, marked by snow and saved by compassion, were exactly where they were meant to be. The first tender shoots of spring emerged from the frost-hardened ground as Pine Hollow stirred from winter's grip. The annual planting rite, a cornerstone of Amish tradition, brought the entire community together in the village square. Families gathered with small cloth pouches of seeds, ready for blessing before the season's planting. Lena and Lyle stood at the edge of the gathering, their small frames nearly hidden behind Elias Brand's imposing figure. The twins exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they belonged in this sacred community ritual. Elder Abram's stern gaze swept over them, his lips tightening as he deliberately turned away. "The children have no household to represent," Jonas announced loudly enough for all to hear. His blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest. "Our traditions are clear about who may participate." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elias stepped forward, his shoulders tensed, but before he could speak, Miriam emerged from the cluster of villagers. The weaver carried 2 small bundles in her arms, her steps purposeful as she approached the twins. "Every child deserves the blessing of new beginnings," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. From her bundles, she produced 2 intricately woven shawls, draping one around each child's shoulders. The twins touched the fabric with wonder. The coarse wool scratched gently against their skin. But the sensation was comforting rather than harsh, a reminder that they were seen, that they existed. Lena traced the intricate pattern with her finger, unaware of the tears welling in Elias's eyes. "These patterns," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "they were my mother's." Miriam nodded. "I remembered. Some traditions are worth preserving because they connect us, not because they divide us." Elder Abram cleared his throat, clearly displeased but unwilling to challenge Miriam openly. The ceremony began with the community forming a circle, voices rising in hymns that had blessed the fields for generations. The twins, now properly attired in their shawls, stood between Elias and Miriam, their small voices gradually joining the collective song. As the blessing of seeds commenced, a white dove descended from the chapel eaves, landing on a fence post mere feet from where the twins stood. The bird remained perfectly still, its presence impossible to ignore. Old Greta gasped audibly. "A sign," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The Lord sends his messengers to those he favors." The dove took flight, just as Elder Abram concluded the blessing. Several villagers crossed themselves, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Jonas scowled, but others, including families who had previously avoided the twins, nodded respectfully toward the children. As they walked home, the twins clutched their seed pouches tightly, the weight of the shawls on their shoulders feeling less like charity and more like belonging with each step they took. The first signs of spring breathed life into the surrounding woods, and with it, Elias Brand found himself embracing a role he never expected. Each morning, the mountain man would wake before dawn, his large frame casting long shadows across the cabin floor as he prepared for the day's lessons. But twins followed him everywhere, their small footsteps creating a rhythm behind his heavy boots. "Watch how the deer leaves tracks different from the fox," Elias explained, kneeling beside a muddy patch near the stream. Lena and Lyle crouched beside him, their pale faces intent with concentration. The girl traced the imprint with her finger, memorizing its shape, while her brother searched for more signs nearby. "Can we track something today?" Lyle asked, his voice stronger than it had been during those first silent weeks in the cabin. The guardian nodded, his beard hiding a smile. "First, you need to learn patience." Days blended into weeks as Elias taught them everything he knew. The twins learned to identify edible mushrooms growing beneath fallen logs, to gather wild herbs for remedies, and to listen to the forest's warnings. When Lena correctly identified yarrow for treating cuts, the mountain man's chest swelled with pride he hadn't felt in years. By mid-spring, Lyle could swing a small axe with surprising precision, chopping kindling while his sister arranged the wood in neat piles. Their hands, once soft and uncertain, grew calloused and confident. The cabin, which had known only silence for so long, now echoed with questions, answers, and occasionally laughter. One evening, while searching for extra blankets in the storage loft, Elias's hand brushed against something smooth and curved. He pulled it forward, dust dancing in the fading light. A cradle, intricately carved with pine trees and stars, emerged from the shadows. His fingers trembled as they traced the patterns he had carved years ago, when hope still lived in his heart. "What's that?" Lena appeared at the ladder, her curious eyes fixed on the wooden cradle. Elias couldn't answer immediately. This cradle had been meant for his own child, a child who never drew breath. He had hidden it away, along with his dreams of family, believing himself unworthy after his loss. "It's for babies," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication that had grown stronger since their arrival. Without words, they helped him bring the cradle down and place it near the hearth. That night, as embers glowed in the fireplace, Elias watched the children sleeping peacefully and felt something long frozen within him begin to thaw. The cradle stood as both reminder and promise, evidence of dreams once abandoned, now slowly taking new form. Perhaps, he realized, watching over these children was not just an act of mercy, but his path back to life itself. Jonas Miller stood at his forge, hammering metal with more force than necessary, each strike echoing his growing resentment. The blacksmith could not stomach how Elias Brand, the mountain outcast, had suddenly gained respect in Pine Hollow. For years, Jonas had cultivated his position through displays of strength and unwavering adherence to tradition. Now this outsider was threatening everything. "A man who lives like a wild animal has no business raising Amish children," he muttered to Samuel, a young apprentice who nodded nervously. The blacksmith wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he gazed toward the distant woods where Elias's cabin stood. "Those twins need proper guidance in our ways, not the teachings of a hermit." Jonas began his campaign subtly. When villagers gathered at the communal well, he would casually mention how the twins looked underfed, their clothes too rough for proper Amish children. "Have you noticed how they flinch when Elias raises his voice?" Then he would whisper, though he had never witnessed such a thing. The blacksmith's workshop became a hub for his manipulations. As villagers brought tools for repair, he would plant seeds of doubt about Elias's character. A man who chose solitude over community for so many years must have something to hide. He suggested to Martha, the baker's wife. What kind of example is that for innocent children? Some villagers resisted his insinuations. The twins seem happier than when they arrived, Miriam pointed out when she delivered a new apron for his forge work. The weaver's quiet defense only fueled Jonas's determination. His boldest move came during a private meeting with Elder Abram. The village leader sat stiffly in Jonas's back room as the blacksmith laid out his proposal. "I could take the twins as apprentices," Jonas offered, sliding a pouch of coins across the table. "My forge needs young hands, and they need proper Amish guidance." Elder Abram's eyebrows rose slightly at the bribe. "You've never shown interest in the orphans before," he noted, leaving the money untouched. "I've always valued tradition," Jonas countered smoothly. "It pains me to see our ways disregarded. The mountain man knows nothing of our faith." The elder remained non-committal, but Jonas could see the seed had been planted. Throughout the following days, the blacksmith noticed villagers gathering in small clusters, their conversations falling silent when others approached. Pine Hollow was dividing into factions, those who supported Elias's guardianship and those who believed tradition must prevail. Jonas smiled as he stoked his forge that evening. The fire's glow illuminated his determined face. Soon, he thought, the twins would be under his control, and Elias Bran would return to his rightful place, alone and forgotten in the wilderness. The late spring blizzard descended without warning, howling through the cracks of Elias Bran's cabin with vengeful fury. The mountain man who had braved countless winters suddenly collapsed beside the hearth, his massive frame shaking with fever. Lena and Lyle exchanged terrified glances as their protector lay vulnerable, his skin burning beneath their small palms. "We need to help him," Lena whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The twins, who had watched Elias gather herbs throughout their months together, knew exactly where he kept his remedies. Lyle dragged another log to the fireplace, struggling with its weight but determined to keep the flames high. "Like Elias showed us," he reminded his sister, mimicking the careful way their guardian had arranged kindling for maximum heat. Through the night, as wind rattled the windows and snow piled against the door, the children worked with quiet efficiency. Lena crushed dried elderberry and yarrow into a paste, just as she had seen the mountain man do when treating their winter coughs. Lyle kept the fire blazing, melting snow for fresh water, his small face set with determination. His mother taught him these remedies, Lena murmured, remembering stories Elias had shared during long winter evenings. She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her touch gentle yet sure. By midnight, Elias's breathing grew labored. The twins took turns applying poultices to his chest and keeping watch. They sang softly, Amish hymns from their earliest memories, their voices blending in the dim cabin. "We won't leave you," Lyle promised, his hand looking impossibly small against Elias's bearskin cloak, now draped across the sick man's chest. Dawn broke with Elias still burning with fever. The children, exhausted but vigilant, continued their ministrations. They had survived abandonment once. They would not abandon him now. When Elias finally opened his eyes on the second day, the blizzard had passed. He found himself surrounded by sleeping children, one curled against each of his sides like small guardian angels. Lena's hands still clutched a cloth, while Lyle's fingers remained wrapped around a wooden spoon used for medicine. The cabin was immaculate. Wood stacked neatly, herbs hanging to dry. Even the old carved cradle had been polished. These children, whom he had saved from the snow, had now saved him. "You stayed," Elias whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Lena stirred first, her eyes widening. "You are family now," she said simply. Lyle nodded in agreement. "We belong together." In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The mountain man who had once believed himself unfit for tenderness felt his guarded heart open completely. They were no longer merely children in his care. They were his children. The fever had burned away the last of his doubts, leaving only certainty in its wake. Family, Elias realized, wasn't about bloodlines or traditions. It was about who stayed when the blizzard came. The Midsummer Fair transformed Pine Hollow's village square into a vibrant tapestry of color and sound. Lena and Lyle stood wide-eyed at the entrance, their small hands clutching Elias Brand's massive fingers. This marked their first. Shouldn't we address the matter of these children before celebrations begin? What precedent do we set, allowing an outsider to claim our own? A hush fell over the nearby villagers. Elias straightened to his full, imposing height, but kept his expression carefully neutral as he guided the twins toward a display of woven goods at Miriam's stall. The law speaks clearly, Jonas continued, stepping forward. Children without parents belong under community guidance, not with a solitary man who rejects our ways. Elder Abram's stern face revealed little as he considered the blacksmith's words. Several community members nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the public confrontation. Before any response could form, a commotion erupted near the chicken coops. A russet fox had slipped through the celebration's perimeter, sending villagers scrambling as it darted toward the unprotected chicks. Without hesitation, Lena and Lyle broke from Elias's side, moving with surprising coordination. Lyle grabbed a broom from a nearby stall, while Lena snatched up a woven basket. Together, they positioned themselves between the predator and its prey. The boy waved the broom with determined sweeps, while his sister quickly gathered the frightened chicks into her basket. "Hi-ya!" Lyle shouted, his small voice fierce as he drove the startled fox away from the vulnerable brood. The entire square watched in astonishment as these children, supposedly helpless themselves, acted with such instinctive courage. Miriam stepped forward, taking the basket of trembling chicks from Lena with a warm smile. "Thank you, little ones," she said loudly enough for all to hear. Quick thinking and brave hearts. Jonas's hammer struck his anvil with particular force as he returned to his demonstration, the metallic clang cutting through the murmurs of admiration now circulating through the crowd. But the damage to his argument was done. The twins had shown themselves to be not just objects of pity, but members of the community worth valuing. Elias placed his hands gently on the children's shoulders, pride evident in his weathered face. In this small moment of courage, the first fragile seeds of acceptance had been planted. Miriam's loom clicked rhythmically as her skilled hands wove threads of blue and gray into a new shawl. The weaver had become increasingly bold in her support of Elias Brand and the twins, though she kept her defiance wrapped in quiet dignity. Each morning, villagers would see her walking the path to Elias's cabin, basket in hand, filled with fresh bread or mended clothes for the children. "The elders can talk all they want about tradition," she told Hannah, the baker's wife, when questioned about her visits. "But I see no tradition worth keeping that abandons children to the cold." One crisp afternoon, as Lena and Lyle helped gather kindling near the cabin, Miriam arrived with a special gift. The twins ran to greet her, their once timid faces now bright with recognition and trust. They had grown fond of the weaver, whose gentle hands always seemed to bring comfort. "I've brought something for Elias," she explained, her voice soft but determined. "Would you fetch him for me?" When the mountain man emerged from the cabin, Miriam unfolded an intricately patterned blanket. "This pattern," she said, tracing the geometric design with her finger, "was your mother's favorite. She taught it to me before she passed." Elias's hands trembled as he touched the fabric. "I remember this," he whispered, his massive frame suddenly seeming smaller with emotion. "She made one for my cradle." "The same pattern I wove into the twins' shawls," Miriam revealed. "I wanted them to carry a piece of your family's legacy even before I knew they would become your family." The revelation struck Elias deeply. This connection to his past, deliberately woven into the present by Miriam's hands, formed another thread in the tapestry binding him to the children. Back in the village, Miriam's actions had not gone unnoticed. Several women began visiting her shop, asking questions about the twins, about Elias. Some even brought small gifts, a jar of preserves, a carved wooden toy, asking Miriam to deliver them. "My husband says Elder Abram won't approve," whispered Sarah, the carpenter's wife, as she handed over a small wooden horse for Lyle. "But my conscience won't let me ignore those children any longer." Jonas the blacksmith observed these changes with growing frustration. "You're undermining our ways," he accused Miriam one day at the market. She merely smiled, continuing to arrange her woven goods. "I'm honoring the oldest tradition we have, compassion." That evening, as Lena helped Miriam wind yarn, the girl looked up with questioning eyes. "Are we still outsiders?" she asked hesitantly. Miriam's hands paused their work. "Less each day," she answered truthfully. "Hearts are changing in Pine Hollow, one thread at a time." The twins slept more peacefully that night, wrapped in the knowledge that beyond Elias's protection, a community was slowly, quietly, beginning to embrace them. The evening gathering in Pine Hollow Square brought villagers together, despite the growing tension. Old Greta Hoffman stood at the center, her weathered hands clutching a leather-bound Bible that had been in her family for generations. The flickering lanterns cast long shadows across her face as she beckoned Lena and Lyle forward. "These children," Greta announced, her voice carrying surprising strength, "were marked by snow, just as the prophecy foretold." She opened the ancient book to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "My grandmother's grandmother wrote of twins who would survive abandonment in winter's cruelest hour, brought home by one who walks alone." Several villagers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jonas crossed his muscular arms, scoffing loudly enough for others to hear. "Convenient that we're only hearing of this prophecy now," the blacksmith muttered. "I've kept silent until I was certain," the storyteller replied, unperturbed by his skepticism. "But who can deny what we've witnessed? The twins surviving the blizzard when they should have perished. The white dove landing beside them during the planting rite. Elias Brand stood protectively behind the children, his massive frame tense. He hadn't put much stock in prophecies, but he couldn't deny the strange circumstances that had brought these children into his life. "My Bible speaks of mercy triumphing over judgment," Greta continued, her gnarled finger tracing the handwritten notes in the margin. "These pages tell us that those who survive the snow are touched by divine providence." Elder Abram stepped forward, his authority visibly challenged. "Our traditions exist for a reason," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The Ordnung guides us in all matters." Miriam, who had been quietly observing from the edge of the gathering, spoke up. "Perhaps sometimes tradition must bend to make room for compassion," the weaver suggested. Several heads nodded in agreement. Lena squeezed her brother's hand, both children wide-eyed as they realized they were at the center of something larger than themselves. Lyle whispered something in his sister's ear that made her smile, despite the tension surrounding them. "I remember my mother speaking of this prophecy," an elderly farmer admitted. "I thought it just a tale to keep children obedient during winter months." The gathering broke into murmurs, with villagers taking sides. Some dismissed old Greta's words as the ramblings of a superstitious mind, while others recalled the dove's appearance with growing wonder. Elder Abram's face showed the internal struggle between upholding the letter of tradition and acknowledging what many now saw as divine intervention. The rigid certainty that had defined his leadership began to crack. As the night deepened, Pine Hollow found itself divided, not by hatred, but by the more complex battle between what had always been and what might yet be. The twins, once invisible, had become impossible to ignore, living embodiments of a choice the village would soon have to make between the safety of tradition and the risk of mercy. The autumn sun cast long shadows through Miriam's weaving shop as Elias Brand ducked his head beneath the low doorframe. His massive frame seemed out of place among the delicate threads and looms. Miriam looked up from her work, her hands never stopping their rhythmic movement across the fabric. "The twins are with old Greta learning about herbs," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to speak with you alone." Miriam nodded, sensing the weight of his words. For several moments, only the soft clicking of the loom filled the space between them. "I wasn't always alone in these mountains," he finally began, his calloused fingers tracing the pattern of a nearby shawl. "I had a wife once, and a son." The weaver's hand stilled as Elias revealed how fever had taken his family years ago. His son, barely 3, had died in his arms despite his desperate attempts to save him. "I couldn't protect them," he continued, his voice breaking. "These hands, they're made for chopping wood and hunting, not for holding something so fragile. After they were gone, I couldn't bear the pity in everyone's eyes, so I left." Miriam listened without judgment as he described his self-imposed exile, how he'd built his cabin far from Pine Hollow, convinced that his strength was a curse rather than a blessing. "I believed I wasn't meant for family," Elias confessed. "That's why I stayed away all these years, until I saw Lena and Lyle in the snow that day." "And yet you stopped," Miriam said softly. "You wrapped them in your cloak." Elias nodded, his eyes distant. "I couldn't walk past them. Something broke inside me, or maybe it healed." The weaver rose from her seat and approached him, unafraid of his imposing presence. "Perfect parents don't exist, Elias. Only those who choose to love despite their fears." She told him how she'd watched him with the twins, his gentleness when teaching Lyle to track, his patience when Lena struggled to carry firewood. "Your strength protects them," she said. "It doesn't threaten them." Back at the cabin that evening, Elias watched the twins preparing their simple meal. They moved differently now, with confidence rather than fear. Lena caught his gaze and smiled, a small gesture that pierced his heart. Lyle placed an extra portion on his plate without a word. They knew something had changed. The mountain man's shoulders seemed lighter, his eyes clearer. The twins exchanged glances, sensing that the walls around Elias's heart had finally begun to crumble, making room for something they all desperately needed: family. The fields of Pine Hollow lay parched under the relentless autumn sun. What should have been golden waves of grain had withered to brittle stalks, and the apple trees drooped with small, hard fruit. Elias Brand watched from his cabin porch as Lena and Lyle knelt in their small garden patch, their small hands cupping the cracked earth. "The beans are dying," Lena whispered, her voice catching. "Just like our corn." The mountain man nodded grimly. The drought had stretched for weeks, turning streams to dusty ribbons and wells to hollow pits. In the village, tensions mounted with each rainless day. Elder Abram had called for additional prayer meetings and stricter adherence to tradition, insisting that hardship was punishment for straying from the old ways. "It's because of them," Jonas had declared at the last gathering, his hammer-calloused finger pointing toward Elias's distant cabin. "The outsider and those children bring misfortune." But prayers and accusations yielded no rain. Families began rationing food, and the communal granary grew emptier by the day. Even the most devout villagers whispered doubts about Elder Abram's leadership as their children went to bed hungry. "We need to try something else," Elias told the twins one morning, shouldering his pack. "The animals always know where water hides." They ventured deep into the hills, following deer trails and watching for green patches amid the brown landscape. Lyle spotted it first, a cluster of vibrant moss nestled between 2 massive boulders. "Look!" The boy dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the rock. "I hear water." Working together, they shifted smaller stones until they uncovered a narrow crevice. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the unmistakable scent of moisture. Elias lowered himself into the opening, disappearing from view until his voice echoed up. "It's here! A spring flowing strong." The children scrambled down to find a crystal pool fed by water seeping through limestone. The hidden spring, protected from the sun, had continued flowing while surface streams dried up. They returned to Pine Hollow carrying jars of precious water, explaining their discovery to astonished villagers. Miriam was the first to embrace the twins, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You've saved us," the weaver whispered. Within days, a water brigade formed. Even those who had shunned the twins now worked alongside them, carrying life-giving water to the neediest crops. The fields began to recover, and with them, the community spirit. Elder Abram watched from the periphery. His authority diminished as villagers turned to Elias for guidance. The rigid laws that had governed Pine Hollow for generations offered no solutions for survival, while the outsider and his orphans had brought salvation. "Perhaps," old Greta remarked loudly as she filled her bucket, "the Lord works through unexpected vessels." The twins exchanged glances, their hands wet with spring water, their hearts full with a sense of belonging that grew stronger than any drought. The water from the hidden spring flowed like liquid hope through Pine Hollow. Elias Brand carried heavy buckets down from the hills, his massive frame bent with purpose rather than burden. Lena and Lyle trailed behind with smaller containers, their faces bright with determination. Together, they irrigated the parched fields one bucket at a time, transforming desperation into possibility. "The mountain man found water when our prayers seemed unanswered," whispered a farmer. Watching his withered corn begin to straighten, the twins worked tirelessly alongside their guardian, their small hands now calloused from labor, but their spirits unbroken. As autumn's golden light spilled across the recovering fields, the villagers' gratitude began to outweigh their suspicion. Families who had once crossed to the other side of the square when seeing Elias now offered him bread and preserves. The twins received shy smiles from children who had previously been forbidden to approach them. "Perhaps we've been too quick to judge," Miriam said as she worked her loom, the rhythmic clacking punctuating her words. The weaver had supported them from the shadows, but now spoke openly in their defense. "The spring they found has saved our harvest." In her cottage, old Greta nodded sagely to visitors. "The children marked by snow bring water in drought," she recited, as if reading from an ancient text. It was foretold. Whether such prophecy truly existed or was born in the moment mattered little. The story spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Jonas the blacksmith pounded his anvil with increasing fury, each strike echoing his resentment. "A lucky discovery doesn't make them family," he growled to anyone who would listen. The man's forge burned hot, but his influence cooled as gratitude warmed the community toward Elias and the twins. Elder Abram faced a different struggle. Standing in his doorway, watching villagers carry water from the spring, the leader's authority seemed to evaporate like morning dew. His laws and traditions offered no solution to the drought, while the outsider and orphans had provided salvation. "The rules exist to protect us," he reminded the council, his voice lacking its usual conviction. Yet even his most loyal supporters glanced toward the reviving fields, then back at him with questioning eyes. At Elias's cabin, Lena placed wildflowers in a jar, while Lyle helped prepare the evening meal. The mountain man watched them with quiet wonder. What had begun as an act of mercy had blossomed into something neither law nor tradition could define. "Tomorrow, we'll bring more water," Elias said softly. The twins nodded, no longer shivering children, but partners in this unexpected journey. Outside, the first stars appeared above Pine Hollow, where fields once doomed now promised harvest, and hearts once closed began to open. The autumn breeze carried the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon through Pine Hollow, as villagers hustled about, preparing for the annual harvest fair. This wasn't just any celebration. It was the time when families would be formally recognized and honored before the entire community, a tradition as old as the village itself. Lena and Lyle worked alongside Elias Brand, their small hands deftly arranging gourds and pumpkins in decorative patterns. The twins had grown noticeably stronger since their rescue in the winter snow, their faces now flushed with health rather than frozen with fear. Though still regarded with curious glances, they moved with growing confidence among the villagers. "You're doing fine work," Elias told them, his massive frame bending to adjust a crooked cornstalk. The mountain man seemed both out of place and perfectly at home among the preparations, his bearskin cloak replaced by a simple wool shirt for the warmer weather. Across the square, Elder Abram watched with narrowed eyes, his lips pressed into a thin line. The village leader had spent weeks consulting ancient community records, searching for precedent on how to handle the twins' unusual situation. Tradition dictated that only established families could participate in the naming ceremony. Yet the twins had become impossible to ignore. "They have no right to stand among us," Jonas muttered to a group of men near his forge. The blacksmith hammered a decorative hook with unnecessary force, sending sparks flying. "No bloodline, no heritage, just strays," Elias picked up. Miriam overheard as she passed with baskets of freshly woven napkins. "And yet they've brought more blessing to Pine Hollow than your bitterness ever has," she replied, loud enough for others to hear. Several women nodded in agreement, emboldened by the weaver's courage. Old Greta shuffled through the square, pausing to pat the twins' heads. "The fair will reveal all," she announced cryptically, her weathered fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. "When names are called, truth cannot hide." As sunset approached, Lena helped arrange candles in glass jars, while her brother assisted with hanging lanterns from tree branches. The girl caught Elias watching them, his eyes reflecting both pride and apprehension. "Will we stand with you tomorrow?" she asked quietly when they returned to his side. The giant man hesitated, his hands stilling on the wooden barrel he'd been positioning. "I don't know what the elders will decide," he admitted, "but in my heart, you already belong." The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared experience. Whatever tomorrow brought, they were no longer alone in the snow. As dusk fell over Pine Hollow, the tension was palpable. The harvest fair would either cement their rejection or mark the beginning of true acceptance. Families retreated to their homes to prepare their finest clothes and rehearse their lineages, while Elias and the twins returned to the cabin that had become their sanctuary, awaiting the dawn that would decide their fate. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Pine Hollow's village square as families gathered for the harvest fair. Wooden tables laden with preserves, quilts, and freshly baked bread lined the perimeter, while children darted between adults with faces sticky from apple cider. The scent of cinnamon and wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with anticipation that was almost palpable. Elias Brand stood at the edge of the gathering, his imposing figure drawing curious glances. Lena and Lyle remained close to his sides, their small hands occasionally reaching for the edges of his bearskin cloak. The twins wore the woven shawls Miriam had gifted them, the intricate patterns catching the afternoon light. "It's time," Elder Abram announced, his voice carrying across the square as he stepped onto the wooden platform erected for the occasion. The villagers fell silent, forming a semicircle before him. "Today we honor the families of Pine Hollow as tradition demands." One by one, families stepped forward to be recognized, parents proudly presenting their children as Elder Abram recited their lineage and place within the community. Jonas stood near the front, arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes narrowing whenever they fell upon Elias and the twins. Miriam moved through the crowd to stand near Elias, offering a reassuring nod. "The children belong here," she whispered, loud enough for only him to hear. Old Greta, her wrinkled hands clutching her family Bible, approached the twins. The storyteller's eyes sparkled with determination as she positioned herself beside them. "These children were marked by snow," she announced to those nearby, her voice stronger than her frail frame suggested. Several villagers shifted uncomfortably, remembering the white dove that had appeared during the spring planting rite. Others whispered about the hidden spring that had saved their crops during the drought. The twins had become woven into the fabric of Pine Hollow's recent history, despite remaining officially unclaimed. Elder Abram's gaze swept across the gathering until it landed on Elias and the children. His mouth tightened into a thin line as he prepared to address the situation that had divided the village for months. "And what of these two?" he finally asked, gesturing toward Lena and Lyle. "Who speaks for them before this community?" The square fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs as tension thickened the air. Lena and Lyle pressed closer to Elias, their faces pale but resolute. The mountain man's hands trembled slightly as they rested on the twins' shoulders. Old Greta stepped forward, her Bible held high. "The prophecy speaks," she declared, "and so must we all." The entire village held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Elias Brand stood in the center of the harvest fair, his massive frame trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the weight of the moment. Tears carved paths down his weathered face as he reached down and, with hands that had chopped countless cords of firewood, gently lifted Lena and Lyle onto his broad shoulders. The twins' small fingers clutched his hair for balance, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. The entire village of Pine Hollow watched in stunned silence. Elder Abram's mouth tightened into a thin line of disapproval, while Jonas gripped his hammer with white knuckles, his plans crumbling before his eyes. "These children," Elias began, his deep voice cracking with emotion, "were abandoned in snow and cold when no one would claim them." He swallowed hard, feeling the twins' weight on his shoulders, a burden he had come to cherish. "But today, before all of you, I declare what has been true in my heart since the day I found them." The mountain man took a deep breath that seemed to fill his entire massive chest. When he spoke again, his voice quivered but rang out clear across the square. "They are mine." 3 simple words that defied generations of tradition. 3 words that challenged the very foundation of Pine Hollow's rigid customs about family and belonging. Miriam stepped forward from the crowd, her fingers still stained with dye from her weaving. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she nodded in silent support. Old Greta raised her gnarled hands skyward, as if receiving divine confirmation of her prophecy. The silence that followed was deafening. Parents pulled their children closer, not in fear, but in unconscious recognition of what they were witnessing. Love transcending law. Lena reached down to touch Elias's cheek, wiping away a tear with her small hand. Lyle sat straighter on the mountain man's shoulder, his chin lifted with newfound certainty of his place in the world. Elder Abram opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. The law was clear, but the scene before him was clearer still. These 3 souls belonged together. The twins' faces glowed in the afternoon sun, no longer pale with cold and fear, but flushed with belonging. The bearskin cloak that had once been their only shelter now hung from Elias's shoulders as a symbol of their shared journey. The silence in the square was not rejection, it was awe. Awe at the courage of a man who had walked alone for so long, now standing before them with 2 children he claimed as his own, daring anyone to deny what was written in their hearts. In that breathless moment, Pine Hollow began to transform. The silence that followed Elias Brand's declaration hung in the air like suspended snowflakes. Then, one by one, the villagers of Pine Hollow began to move. Miriam was the first, stepping forward with tears streaming down her weathered face. She embraced Lena and Lyle, wrapping her arms around them as if to weave them permanently into the fabric of the community. "These children belong here," she announced, her voice steady despite her tears. The weaver turned to face Elder Abram, whose stern countenance had cracked, revealing uncertainty beneath. His authority, once absolute as the changing of seasons, wavered visibly before the gathered crowd. The elder opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. The law he had upheld for decades offered no guidance in the face of such raw devotion. He simply nodded, a gesture small in movement, but monumental in meaning. Old Greta hobbled forward, her ancient Bible clutched to her chest. "The prophecy speaks true," she declared, her voice carrying across the square. "Children marked by snow, saved by compassion's hand, shall bring renewal to our land." The storyteller reached up to touch each twin's cheek. What was written has come to pass. Even Jonas stood speechless, his hammer hanging limply at his side. The blacksmith's schemes had dissolved like morning frost under the warmth of what he witnessed. His gaze dropped to the ground, perhaps in shame, perhaps in reluctant acceptance. Families began to approach Elias and the twins, offering small gifts: a loaf of bread, a carved wooden toy, a jar of preserves. Each item represented not just sustenance but acceptance, the physical manifestation of the community embracing those once considered outsiders. Lena and Lyle clung to Elias's massive hands, their small fingers intertwined with his calloused ones. The girl's eyes shone with wonder, while their brother stood straighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his small shoulders. "You have taught us," Miriam said, addressing not just Elias, but the entire gathering. "That tradition without mercy is like winter without spring." The twins, who had planted seeds in frozen ground as an act of hope, now saw their true harvest. Not crops, but community. They had been abandoned in snow at the edge of Pine Hollow, but now stood firmly at its heart. As the sun began to set over the harvest fair, casting long golden shadows across the square, it illuminated not just 3 individuals, but a transformed village. Pine Hollow had been changed as surely as Elias and the twins themselves. The orphans abandoned in the snow had found more than Elias's cabin to call home. They had found Pine Hollow itself. The first snowflakes of winter drifted past the cabin window, their gentle descent a stark contrast to the blizzard that had brought Elias Bran and the twins together nearly a year before. Lena pressed her small palm against the glass, her breath creating a foggy circle as she watched the white blanket slowly cover their yard. "It's different this time," she whispered, feeling Lyle's presence beside her without needing to look. Elias stoked the fire, his massive frame now a source of comfort rather than intimidation to the children. The flames cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls of the cabin that had transformed from a lonely outpost to a true home. The mountain man smiled as he watched the twins, still marveling at how these 2 small beings had changed everything. "Come sit," he called, his voice gentle, yet carrying easily across the room. "I've got a story to tell." The twins scampered over, settling on either side of him on the bearskin rug. Lyle leaned against Elias's arm, no longer flinching at physical contact as he once had. The boy had grown stronger over the months, his hands now capable of helping with chores that once seemed impossible. Outside, Pine Hollow prepared for winter in a new spirit of community. Earlier that day, Miriam had delivered freshly woven blankets, her eyes crinkling with affection as she embraced each child. Even Elder Abram had nodded respectfully to Elias in the village square, a silent acknowledgement that traditions could bend without breaking. "Do you remember what old Greta told us about children marked by snow?" Elias asked, wrapping his arms around both children. "That we were chosen," Lena answered, her voice stronger now than the timid whisper it had once been. "Not just chosen," Elias corrected gently, "but meant to change things. And look what you've done." Through the window, they could see villagers moving between houses, carrying baskets and bundles, preparations for the long winter ahead. But unlike last year, there were no suspicious glances toward the cabin in the woods, no whispers of disapproval. The carved cradle that had once represented Elias's lost dreams now sat in the corner, filled with pine boughs and winter berries, a symbol transformed from grief to celebration. Lyle had helped gather the decorations himself, proud to contribute to their home. "We belong here," the boy said simply, stating what had once seemed impossible. Elias nodded, emotion tightening his throat. The man who had once walked the mountains alone now found himself at the center of a family, his solitude replaced by the sweet chaos of raising children. As the snow continued to fall, wrapping Pine Hollow in its quiet embrace, the three sat together by the fire, no longer strangers thrust together by circumstance, but a family forged through love, courage, and the willingness to believe in new beginnings.